Be agreed to, and I call the member for Lalor.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. I rise to support the amendments to this bill as moved by the member for Gorton, the Shadow Minister. Deputy Speaker, the government has finally stopped running away from this bill. If I remember, this was all part of the campaign, an election campaign that ran for 8 weeks, and finally the government came to look at the situation that is rampant. It's certainly rampant in my community, Deputy Speaker. We had case after case come before us in the newspapers to highlight that there were many vulnerable workers being exploited, many being ripped off, Deputy Speaker. There's no other way to say it. This is long overdue, and it does not go far enough, and it would do much better if the government took on board Labor's policies and implemented them around this piece of legislation. But it's good to see that at least here today we are doing something about what has become a great shame in our country, a shame where workers are going to work and not being paid appropriately, Deputy Speaker. It is wage theft that has been occurring and been highlighted for us by the media. And the bill goes some way towards dealing with the exploitation of workers, so for that reason we support its passage through the parliament. At least it's a start, it's something. Having said that, it's inadequate, and it's inadequate for a few reasons. It falls significantly short of Labor's suite of policies and legislative reform that we first announced 12 months ago, well before this government even turned its mind to protecting workers, before Labor forced this government to start talking about and protecting vulnerable workers. This bill does nothing in relation to a range of policies which we took to the last election, does nothing about combating sham contracting, nothing about licensing labour hire companies, shutting down the practice of companies phoenixing to avoid wage liabilities. It does nothing to reform the Fair Work Act to strengthen protection for workers. It doesn't criminalise employer conduct that involves the use of coercion, and does nothing about making it easier for workers to recover unpaid wages from employees and directors of responsible companies. Deputy Speaker, we should not be surprised that this legislation doesn't go far enough. We only need to look at this government's record. We only need to look at the fact that they are being driven by media coverage to bring this piece of legislation into the parliament, and that they will resist amendments. It is a fig leaf in terms of the issues that have been highlighted through the media, and it is a fig leaf in terms of their track record about protecting vulnerable workers. And of course, we have on record their support for the penalty rate cut to drive home the point that they really don't understand the fate of vulnerable workers, Deputy Speaker. The Turnbull government has no consideration for workers who rely on penalty rates, some of whom are the lowest paid workers in the country. In the electorate of Lalor, we are in the top 10 in terms of electorates where people are reliant upon those penalty rates. There are over 8,800 retail workers and over 4,600 hospitality workers who will see a reduction in their take-home pay under this government's watch. They sit with those other workers who have been exploited under this government's watch. It is no surprise, Deputy Speaker, that Malcolm Turnbull has again decided to do nothing to protect those workers who are going to face a real pay cut through the changes to penalty rates. He has made it clear he will not stand up for the lowest paid workers in our community. He has unequivocally supported penalty rate cuts, ignoring how many Australian families will be worse off. And these impacts are very real. In fact, if we look at some of the other things that this government has been doing, it seems to me that there's an absolute lack of understanding about the impact, of course, on women, who make up the most number of those workers who rely on penalty rates, and young people, of course, Deputy Speaker. And of course, young people again have been targeted in this budget through the higher education changes, through the cuts to universities, to the lowering of the threshold for when their help repayments will begin, Deputy Speaker, and a rise in the cost and their contribution on those loans. Deputy Speaker, it is not a surprise that this government does not understand that a $77 pay cut will have enormous impact on families in the electorate of Lalor, an enormous impact on their capacity to pay their bills, and an enormous impact on our local economy when that money is no longer being circulated through our economy. Unlike the government, Deputy Speaker, Labor understands the importance of penalty rates, and we understand the importance of protections for vulnerable workers. And that is why the bill that we have in front of the House would protect the 700,000 workers who will be worse off under the penalty rate cuts. Deputy Speaker, the bill in front of us does not go far enough to protect vulnerable workers, even aside from the penalty rate cuts. It does not go far enough to protect those workers that we have seen on the front pages of our newspapers who have suffered from wage theft, Deputy Speaker. They cannot hide the fact that they support cuts to low-income earners and that they are presenting for us a fig leaf for vulnerable workers. It is a thin veil, Deputy Speaker, that this government is sitting behind today. We know that inequality in Australia is a 75-year high, with wage growth at historic lows and underemployment and unemployment at record highs. But this government decides to continue to pursue the cut to penalty rates while providing a $50 billion cut to big business. Deputy Speaker, denying workers a fair day's pay for a fair day's work is one example of employers who make a mockery of workers' rights. Many employers undermine worker welfare through the deliberate and systemic denial of these rights, and we have seen that across our papers. And I think it's worth stopping to really think about this for a moment, Deputy Speaker. It is my belief that in this country, in this economy, that our industrial relations system relies upon a healthy union environment to make sure that these things work, Deputy Speaker. And I think it's a sad indictment that there are people in our community who believe, quite wrongly, that the establishment of the Fair Work Commission will protect workers. As those headlines have shown, the Fair Work Commission can only do the work if workers make a complaint, if those things are brought to light. And it is an indictment that we had to rely on investigative journalists to find out and showcase what was happening to workers in this country, Deputy Speaker. I would note that we only knew of this systemic exploitation that has been occurring because journalists uncovered it, Deputy Speaker. In a robust system, with a more unionised workforce, these things would not occur. Deputy Speaker, 12 months ago, Labor introduced legislation in the Senate to address the wholesale undermining of workers' rights that has become pervasive under the Abbott-Turnbull governments. It is Labor who acted, while the Abbott-Turnbull government did nothing to address the serious allegations and shameful treatment of workers by well-known companies. And they are here today in this debate saying, speaker after speaker, that they are outraged by the treatment of these workers, outraged and condemning those companies who have been doing the wrong thing, Deputy Speaker, but they've been dragged kicking and screaming to put in place protection for workers. And we know, and we've heard speaker after speaker today go through some of the wage theft situations that were occurring. We know that there were vulnerable workers, many of them on visas, who were being targeted quite systemically to provide a low-wage situation for businesses who should have known better and who, in fact, did know better, Deputy Speaker. So many stakeholders have raised concerns that the provisions of the bill, which give the Fair Work Ombudsman the power to compel people to answer questions, do not contain procedural protections which might have been expected to have been included in such a regime, and many speakers have addressed that today. In particular, the bill fails to meet the procedural protections that apply to the ABCC compulsory questioning power, and that seems an anomaly. Deputy Speaker, giving a government agency the power to compel citizens to answer questions and remove the right to silence is a significant responsibility. It is imperative that we are vigilant to ensure that these powers are proportionate and appropriate safeguards to their exercise are in place. Stakeholders have made strong arguments, so we are here, Deputy Speaker, because although there has been consultation and although stakeholders have readily been involved in those processes, they think this legislation does not go far enough. The government has chosen to follow Labor's reforms to some extent, and to do what's been asked by the stakeholders, but have not gone far enough, Deputy Speaker. Deputy Speaker, where a worker makes a claim for unpaid wages from an employer who has failed to keep proper employment records, it should be that employer that is held to account and has to prove that they paid the worker what was owed. This seems such a simple concept. If you sit with constituents who have been part of these processes, it doesn't take long to realise that there's something wrong with the law when it is up to a worker to prove what they should have been paid. It is up to a worker to provide pay slips to prove what they've been paid when, Deputy Speaker, we know that in our communities there are many workers who are not being provided with pay slips, and they are not all foreign workers. They are not all students on visitor visas. They are young people in my community who can come and tell me that they have been working for 3 years and have not received a pay slip. Deputy Speaker, last week I was in the electorate talking to a person, and we were chatting about her new job and how much she was enjoying it, and over the course of the conversation she then started to talk to me about the superannuation that had not been paid to her in her previous job. 3 years' worth of superannuation, Deputy Speaker. Now, we all understand the way the superannuation system works. We understand that the early money in that process is what is important. We understand that the income, that putting the low-income superannuation contribution, Labor introduced that for that very reason, to encourage young people, to have young people understand how important it was to get those superannuation contributions happening early. And yet, despite that, we have employers out there who see that as part of their cash rather than as part of the pay to their workers, Deputy Speaker. This is rampant in communities like mine, and this legislation does not go far enough to stamp it out, Deputy Speaker. The early money is critical to ensure that people have the retirement funds that they need. This government saw the light and reintroduced the low-income superannuation contribution. They put that back, so they understand the importance of early money. You think, therefore, in looking at this legislation, they would take the advice and go further than they have done, Deputy Speaker. Of course, as I've said, the bill does not go far enough in that area, nor does it go far enough around to address the casualisation of the workforce that is happening under this government's nose, on this government's watch. In fact, one could argue, Deputy Speaker, that all of these things together are driving down wages and conditions of Australian workers, and that's why this government doesn't want to act, Deputy Speaker. I, with many of the residents in the community that I live and represent, actually believe that it's part of the overall plan, Deputy Speaker, to not address the issues of sham contracting, to not address the issues raised around labour hire companies, Deputy Speaker, when there was clearly an opportunity to do so, when there was public goodwill to do something about this exploitation. This government should have taken further action, Deputy Speaker, but they have chosen not to. They've chosen not to listen to stakeholders. They've chosen not to look into registering labour hire companies or to addressing workers' rights under those contracts, Deputy Speaker, and for that they should stand condemned. Labor agrees with what this legislation is doing, but we would argue strongly that it needs to go much further than that, that workers need protection, not just vulnerable workers, Deputy Speaker, because the number of workers who we can now put into that vulnerable category is growing every day, Deputy Speaker. I have real concerns about the levels of anxiety that people are living with in the community that I represent. The number of people who are working through third-party labour hire companies who are sitting up until midnight to get a text to know whether they've got work tomorrow, who are having dinner with their families, not sure how many days' work they're going to get this week, Deputy Speaker. This number of workers that we would call vulnerable is growing every day, and the legislation before the parliament, this government brought into this parliament, is not going far enough to protect them. I would encourage the government to re-look at the amendments that Labor is proposing, to go further with this legislation, to get serious about protecting vulnerable workers by reducing the number of vulnerable workers, by taking real action about industrial relations in this country. I would make a final comment, Deputy Speaker, that I believe that the market cannot do this work on its own. Institutions cannot do this work on their own. What we need in this country is a healthy union sector that can do this work for us, Deputy Speaker, because workers don't get exploited where they have representation, Deputy Speaker. It really is that simple.
I thank the